The Greater Centerville Historians organized in the year 2000. The purpose of the organization is to preserve the history of the Township of Centerville, Cleveland and surrounding area. Gerald O'Neill, Charlie Bauer, Richard Wiggin, and myself, Kathleen Sixel, were the founding members. In 1831, the territory south of Green Bay was sold to the U.S. government by the Native Americans who had title to the land. The consideration was the promise of a reservation in another state. The Township of Centerville was established in 1850. The township had a village called Centerville. The reason for the hamlet's original name of Centerville was, in the days of the Indians, there was a trail along Lake Michigan between Manitowoc and Sheboygan. This heavenly spot was exactly at the halfway mark, so the early white man gave it the name Centerville. In 1849, the village of Centerville was surveyed and laid out in lots and blocks. The village of Centerville was renamed Hika when the Postmaster General informed the village leaders that another Centerville was located in the state. When it became time for Centerville to be renamed, a judge in Manitowoc by the name of Albert Schmidt would take kids hiking. The judge said, "You can't call a town hiking, so why not make it Hika?" Thus the village of Centerville became Hika. In the early years, Centerville had the vision of becoming a lake port. To encourage ships to dock there, 2 piers were built into Lake Michigan. Many German immigrants arrived by schooners, and the village began to grow. The village had a brick factory, stores, schools, a Lutheran and a Catholic church, mills, saloons, blacksmith shop, and a fire department, and a brewery. When the brewery was built, the settlement began to flourish. But when fire destroyed the brewery, the largest industry, there was no longer a need for the harbor facilities. So ended this chapter of the development of Hika. 2 miles west of Hika, another settlement known as St. Wendel began to grow. It had a Catholic church, a general store with a connected dance hall, and a post office was also located in the complex, a funeral parlor, and at one time a motel. With the clearing of the forest, tilling of the land began. This prompted the exporting of lumber and grains. The farmers of Centerville looked forward to the building of a railway since they had a serious problem transporting their products. In 1873, the Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western Railroad was built between the settlements of Hika and St. Wendel and was named Centerville Station. In 1880, Centerville Station was renamed Cleveland after President Grover Cleveland. Cleveland, at that point in time, owes its growth to the fact that the Township of Centerville was a rich farming community, and farmers for miles around would bring products to be shipped by rail or ship. The village of Cleveland had several grocery stores, a furniture store, a funeral parlor, several saloons, Lutheran church, hardware stores, several gas stations, newspaper, photographer studio, several car dealerships, cheese factory, several feed mills, livestock yard, and lumber yards. The biggest business was the Cleveland Co-op, which offered many types of services. With the failing of grain crops, the farmers began dairy farming. With the abundance of milk, another industry began, cheese and butter making. Local cheese factories dotted the countryside. One-room schools were usually built near the cheese factories, so children would have a ride to school when farmers brought their milk. In 1958, Hika, St. Wendel, and Cleveland incorporated into the village of Cleveland. In 1968, the Cleveland Elementary School was built. The Township of Centerville has seen many farming changes, but dairy farming is still the primary vocation. Today, Cleveland is known as the seat of Lakeshore Technical College, which offers an educational alternative to 4-year colleges. An ancient proverb states, When an old person dies, a library burns to the ground. These words were the inspiration for organizing the Greater Centerville Historians. We hope to preserve as many memories as possible.
Been presented with a question, and she'd like to identify herself, please.
Kate Judy. The corridor was I-57 was it was to be on Highway 57, which runs through Plymouth and then would go into Kiel, I believe, and that route. And the Ford family, there was a Ford farm, were really instrumental in organizing that corridor. And it was interesting because they'd already purchased a lot of the land. If you drive on Highway 57, you can see how wide the roadbed is there. It had already been purchased for a 4-lane highway. It was just a 2-lane highway, but the land had been purchased for a 4-lane highway. And that was the original path for the interstate system to go up through Kiel and into Green Bay. And it was defeated, and it was kind of sad and ironic that Ed Klessig, who was fighting I-50, or the proposed 57 route, that then it should be put in his backyard.
Yeah.
Now there was a small deviation made in the route of I-43 of the path that we know it today, and that occurred just north of where the Klessig property ends, and then it was to go more northerly, but it veered off to the east and connected with the existing Highway 141.
Okay.
And a portion of Highway 141 was then utilized.
Okay.
And that is I think it connects just north of the Lakeshore Technical College is where that connection is made. And so it veered there, and that's the only deviation that was made after the proposed route of I-43 was created. So that was the only concession that was made, and it did save a little bit of land, not enough in our standpoint. There were 2,000 acres involved, which accounted for about 200 farms of 100-acre size. I think that we always said that the average
the average farm size
was about 100 acres at that time. And so it amounted to about 200 farms that
So you're
that
saying
land
2,000 acres from the Sheboygan?
from the Sheboygan to Green Bay.
Green Bay.
And there was a wetland area in Green Bay, and that brought some college students and professors into the scene, and they were there also for when we were standing in front of the bulldozers.
Okay.
And that was a
Could you
exciting experience.
Yes. Could you, at this, if I may override Richard just one moment, that location, I saw it in the paper when it happened, but where were we as far as location?
It was at Polifka Corners is where we met, and then we transferred over to the Kenneth Tesrick farm.
Okay.
So I think the Polifka Corners is in Francis Creek.
Beyond that,
It's a little north.
between Francis Creek and Kelly.
Okay. So
Okay.
that's where we met, and then walked onto the roadway. It had already been carved out, and we stood in front of the bulldozers.
And what time of day was that?
It certainly was daylight. I would have to say it would have been maybe late morning or early afternoon. Certainly between the milking hours. It was, the first day was on Thursday that we went there. And we were amazed at the police force at that time, and the naivety perhaps of myself, and that we're just farm people. Like, I'm a city girl, you know, I hadn't had any of this kind of exposure before, but we were all very much committed into preserving the farmland and being heard. And so when we went out there, walked out there, it was a big deal for us. We weren't just being little smart alecky kids. We were adults and very committed. And it was scary. It truly was scary. And the first day we went, my husband, we weren't married at the time, but Kanud was with us. And we were amazed at the police force. They had a young man who had the holster showing right on his chest, and we were afraid that he was just really this kind of gung-ho copy kind of person, you know. No, he was scary. But we went out there and we stood in front, and yes, indeed, we did stop the bulldozers for a while. And that was the day that Carl Klessig got arrested with this John, what was his name? Hushagin, or Hushagn. I didn't know that young man. I think he was a friend of Carl's. But they were released that same day within about 15 minutes. And George Wanish was the sheriff, and he's talking with his little horn and stuff. Well, we came back and met, I believe, at Klessig's, and we were going to go back the next day. And should we go back? And who should go back? And I made sure that my husband didn't go back, because I thought, my gosh, if he gets arrested, he might be deported, because he's this Danish citizen. Yes. And so I didn't want him to be in harm's way, and that I didn't want to lose him. And so he had to stay home. And he was working in the barn. He worked for Norbert Orth at the time. And we went the second day. We met again at the Kenneth Tesserick farm, and we're all lined up on the borderline. And there's mounds of dirt and stuff from where the route has already been created. And I looked at my friend Darlene Wellner. Darlene Wellner is a very long-standing member of the League of Women Voters, and the League of Women Voters supported the cause on a land use issue. And I looked at her and I said, well, are you ready? I said, this is what we came for. And the two of us led the group, and a lot of kids followed us. And we walked out that second time, and we were told that there were extra police that came from Green Bay, from Brown County, that they had dogs with them. And we went out there. And then, of course, the police came running after us and telling us to stop, and we didn't stop. And we did stop in front of the bulldozers. We stood our ground. I have to say that just from a historical perspective, it may sound kind of bragging, but there were only two people there who did not run, and they were Darlene Wellner and myself. And it may be interesting to you to note that neither of us were affected landowners, and we both women, obviously. So that may be of little interest. It's interesting to note also that Ed Klessig did not trespass on that day, but the police ran after him and arrested him. So that was, a bit of interest there. They wanted him, I tell you. It was important to get Ed Klessig, and they did. So then we were all taken back in a bus. We were loaded into a bus, those of us that were arrested, and fingerprinted, had our mugshots taken, put in jail. We were locked up, and the bang of the gates or whatever, the doors, it was a big deal. It was scary. Yeah. And then Betty Orth, Norbert Orth was one of them, got arrested, and Betty Orth went to the bank and borrowed money and put up the bail for every single one of us. And of course, we then paid her back after that, but she's the one that got us out.
Do you remember
And
the bail price at that at that
I
time?
think it was just about $50. It wasn't
Okay.
enormous.
Yes.
It was not an enormous sum of money.
Okay.
But I was determined that I was going to stay there overnight and, really, this is our issue and this is what we're here for. Well, that lasted all of about 5 minutes. I wasn't going to be there all by myself, and too many people were leaving, and I thought, well, I'm not going to be here all alone, so then I too allowed myself to be bailed out.
Okay, very good, thank you.
It's interesting to know that the charges were actually dismissed. We did appear before Judge Miller. We all were agreed to plead not guilty and go for a trial.
Mhm.
And all of the adults were in agreement except for Norbert Orth, and he pleaded guilty. And the judge just kind of laughed at him and dismissed him because none of us were guilty, and that there would be only one person who would be guilty. We originally were charged with trespassing, but because some of us never trespassed, like Ed Klessig, they changed the charges to unlawful assembly. And it's interesting to note that this was shortly after the bombing down in Madison of the UW, one of the buildings at the University of Wisconsin, in protest of the Vietnam War. And they had passed legislation about unlawful assembly, so they charged us with unlawful assembly.
Mhm.
But on that day that we went in to meet with the judiciary, the charges were dismissed and we all went home with no record. However, they have my fingerprints, so I have to be careful.
As far as the day and the year and the month, do you have that?
It
at all?
was in 1976, I don't
June,
remember,
early
in June,
I think.
early June.
Yeah, I think, was it two days in a row or 3 days in a row?
We would have a closer record on the actual,
Okay.
do you have it on this list here of the day that we were arrested?
I don't have the date.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
We do have a lot of paper clippings, newspaper clippings, so that we could get that information from there.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that personal
I have a lot of
situation.
personal stuff.
Yes. Well, thank you again. Okay, we got a question on the floor. Go right ahead, please.
I'm Alice Messias,
Yes.
and I'm just wondering, we go up north all the time on I-43, and we often wonder, how could all these cars go on a 2-lane highway?
Yes.
And I often wonder, all these farmers that protested on that route, are they feeling good about it now that that road is there, or do they still sort of feel inwardly that they lost a lot?
Okay. Good question. Good question. We got a question on the floor, and this young lady will identify herself and give us maybe some information.
Kate Judy. I use I-43 every day to go to work. Originally, I had sworn that I never would, that I would take the back roads, and that lasted maybe for about 2 weeks. The Interstate Alternative Association was not against road building. The Interstate Alternative Association was for an alternative route. We wanted the corridor of 141 to be utilized more, to be widened, and therefore taking a lot less land. We wanted it to be a 4-lane expressway rather than an interstate highway with limited access. So we were not against road building. We saw the need for, especially from Manitowoc north to Green Bay, was extremely, I would say almost hazardous route, and very much in need of repair. But we felt that there could have been bypasses of the little villages and then reconnection with the 141 highway itself, the existing highway. The reason that I-43 was built and not an alternative type of highway was that the interstate system was funded 90% by the federal government. So the local municipalities and state only had to put up 10%. Alternate, less restricted, meaning access restricted road would only be funded, I believe it was 80%, and it was a money question.
Mhm.
I'd like you to address some of, when we were, I'm pointing at Richard Wiggin, when we were looking through things, we found the monies that were returned to the state, where these landowners took the money that they got. And it's interesting to note that Ed Klessig's was only $1,000, where some people had really a huge impact with $19,000 checks. Wasn't one of them 1810? You know, that
$1,000 worth of land.
Ed Klessig was one of the lesser affected farmers, but yet one of the most active. So another testament to his involvement in this issue.
Okay, with the question, I got a two-part question, if you would. The each mile at the I-43 corridor, what amount of acreage was used up for that, for each mile? Is that a possibility? And do they come along and condemn your land and then pay you out whatever the going rate is? Is that the way they also handle it?
They seized the land under eminent domain.
Say that word again, please.
Eminent domain.
Okay.
And the actual, we could compute it.
Okay.
There were 2,000 acres, and you just divide that by the number of miles from Sheboygan to Green Bay.
Okay.
So that could be computed.
Okay.
It was 2,000 acres of land that they seized.
Okay.
And there was, after it was a fact and it was going through, the amount that was paid the farmers was not enough. And a lot of the farmers disputed it under the recommendation of all of those involved,
Mhm.
because they were underpaid. And they did get some larger stipend, I think, at the end because of our involvement. So
Okay.
it did help the farmers a little bit in the end.
Mhm.
You can speak to that.
Okay, I'll be right there. Thank you. Okay, gentleman raised his hand. He'll identify himself, please.
Richard Wiggin, remind me again what I'm supposed to address here, because there's a number of issues. What I want to start with is, besides the small concession that the interstate made to take those 2 or 3 miles or whatever, 141, they were also going to put in a bike path or a horse path or something along the interstate, and we got pretty upset about that, and they took that out. So that was another concession they made. They were pretty small, in terms of the highway. They didn't make it any narrower, or, even though the interstate highway is very narrow in the city of Milwaukee, all of a sudden it just narrows down, and there's only 10 feet of space between, these two lanes. Out in the countryside, and I forget what it is, but the highway's 200 feet wide or something, or I forget what it is, but it's fairly wide,
Yeah,
and there's
wow.
60, I don't know how many feet in the middle, and got to be so much feet on the right and the left. I know at the time when I read the environmental impact statement, the interstate highways cost $1 million a mile. And the interchanges, depending, I guess, on whether they were diamond interchanges or cloverleaf interchanges, or whether they were just overpasses, they were probably $1 million or more each. I don't think you could build an interstate now for less than 15 million a mile or something like that. I don't know, the prices would have gone up a lot. The original intention of the interstate highway system was based on an idea by Dwight Eisenhower during his presidency, and he got the Interstate Act, or whatever it was called, passed through Congress in 1956. So that the interstate system is 50 years old this year. And he was impressed by the German Autobahns during World War II when we were fighting against Germany, how the Germans could move people, troops, tanks, heavy stuff on their big highways in Germany. They were solid, they were made of concrete, not just blacktop on gravel, et cetera, and he got this idea that we should connect all cities of 50,000 or more with an interstate highway system, and with a few exceptions, that is what happened in the United States. I mean, now of course there's cities that have gone over 50 that maybe aren't connected by interstates. But Green Bay was a city of, I think, 60,000 at the time. So that was the reason. And these highways are constructed as like, I don't know what you say, brick sheep sheds or something. I mean, they're really strong highways, and they're built to be able to take tanks and missiles and traveling over them, and to evacuate cities, which I think that's quite idealistic. I don't think you're going to evacuate a city very easily, very quickly, but they were to move people and military traffic and commercial traffic and trucks. The trucking industry loved the interstate. So these things were built quite strongly. And the other thing is there's sections of interstate that have to be straight without overpasses. And I think there's a section, well, there are overpasses, but there's a straight section between Cleveland and Erdman or Sheboygan, because you can also land an aircraft on the highway in an emergency. I don't know how they get under these overpasses, but there are sections of interstates that have to be open and straight to land emergency aircraft on. So that was another thing that was built into the interstate plan. I want to address the question about, do we use the highway? Yeah, everybody uses it now. It's a nice highway to drive on. I think what it has done for the village of Cleveland, and the village of Cleveland was already mostly a bedroom community, I think, by the 70s. We used to have a lot of businesses and whatnot in the village here. It was a commercial center. It isn't anymore. It's a bedroom village for people who work in Sheboygan and Manitowoc. I think what the interstate has done, it's probably kept Cleveland small. I think other than Lakeshore Tech, which is where we're meeting here tonight, which had an impact on the population of Cleveland probably wouldn't have grown at all. Because people can now run to Sheboygan or Manitowoc or Green Bay or Milwaukee to do their shopping or to do something important, and they don't have to, buy things locally anymore. So that's, there are a lot of impacts of interstate highways on small towns. A lot of small towns disappeared out west. They just completely dried up and disappeared. Right. Because of interstate. So that's, I don't know what else I was supposed to talk about here, but those were some things.
About the money.
About the money. You mean for the farmers?
Sending the checks back to them.
Yeah, I found that in the literature. I forget, there were 10 or 12 farmers who sent their money back. They were paid and they sent it back. Well, I think they eventually were paid and kept it, but they sent it back, and then there was some correspondence about the state should resend the checks or something like that to the landowners. So.
Did they send them back because they weren't satisfied with it?
More as a protest?
It was, well, I'm sure it was, part of it was a protest, and I'm sure some of them were not happy with the amount that they were paid. And they were supposed to be paid something like the going rate for farmland in the area, per acre at that time. So I think we have some questions. Yes.
We got a gentleman who has his hand up and a question. Go right ahead, please.
Fred Jacoby. Richard brought up a couple points, and I just want to add a little bit to it. The interstate highway plan was sold at the time in the mid-50s during the Eisenhower administration on a national defense plan. That was the way it went through, and that's how it was funded. And
okay.
You can't argue against it so well, it's hard to bring an argument against it, and that's what happened there. And then the idea about the straight mile, there's a certain interval, and I don't know what it is. It's like every 7 or 8 or 10 miles has to be one straight mile for planes.
Just a mile.
Yeah, one straight, there has to be at least one straight mile in every,
10
it's
mile
like an
segments?
8 or 10 mile interval.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Yeah, 4 planes, yeah.
Thank you. We got a gentleman here, raise his hand. Go right ahead, please.
Melvin Yanish, and to tell you how bitter it was, I knew Bill Ford, I knew Sigmund Billets. That's when I caught Todd on this, but Roland Wither was a neighbor of Lewis's, and he told the traffic cop from Sheboygan County to send the commissioner down here. He wanted to take a pot shot at him. And he said, you wouldn't do anything that fool. I don't realize what he said. That would be for the benefit of my neighbor. And Bill Ford was a man who went to Manitowoc and to Rivers and got them involved that the I-43 would come on this side.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, we got a gentleman with his hand up. Right ahead, please.
John Wiggin. If I could backtrack a little bit, first of all, the picture was from 1980, I remember that.
Good.
Back to the board meetings, at the time when Ed and his people were going before the Manitowoc and Sheboygan County boards, the Manitowoc County board is kind of interesting. Ed's father was on the board at that time in the beginning, early 70s. His name was Edwin Klesick, but he represented the city of Kiel. That's where he lived. And in the first vote that they took on it, Edward's father, voted in favor of it, as he misunderstood the vote. And of course, when Edward found out about it, he corrected him on it. He said, Grandpa, how could you? And but Edwin had misunderstood the vote, and he switched the next time around.
Okay.
Go back to the highway walk with March 1975. I participated, I believe, 2 of the 4 days. I just have a few memories of it. Channel 2 came out and filmed us that one day.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe it was Chuck Ramsey was working for Channel 2 at that time, and he
Okay.
and somebody else were out there. And
Sure.
one of the two asked Knut Anderson, who was walking with me and Francis Salm, are there a lot of people behind you yet? And, coming around the corner, there was a bend in the road and the trees, they couldn't see. And then Knut said, yeah, there are about 200 coming in, which was a gross exaggeration. If there were maybe 25 or 30, but Knut said it with a straight face, and, when the reporter left, Francis started laughing real much. And as far as taunts, there was one farmer that was on his porch or in the clover area, and he hollered out something to us. I don't know what he said, but something in effect, we're a little bit crazy. And then I remember Knut Anderson answering him. He said, you better go back to Mama. And then he went back in the house again. But those were, kind of fun things. In Clover, I know there was a tavern keeper there that took us in for, warm up and have a drink. This was in March, when we were walking in.
Yeah, pretty cold
he was favorable to us. Clover Inn. I don't know what the guy's name was, but.
Okay.
And just one other note, you were talking about Edward before, and it's unfortunate that nobody from Klesick's is here tonight. We invited them, they didn't come, but I don't know how you realize how intensely involved Edward was in this thing for about 5 years. He would drop everything when anything was going on like this.
Mm-hmm.
He went to the board meetings in Manitowoc and Sheboygan, and I remember my brother Richard was at the Sheboygan County one, and they were conducting other business, nothing to do with I-43, and Ed just got up and started talking about the I-43, totally out of order, and they had to tell him to sit down. He went everywhere. I know one night I stopped over there, he was on his way to Sheboygan Falls, I believe. He was already late for the meeting that they were going to have there, but he was still going. He was putting gas in his car. Another time, he called me up in the morning about 8 o'clock. He was still milking it. I was supposed to go down in that area down there, Sheboygan Falls area, where this Mr. Bullets lives, and there was a protest down there. And he was wondering if I could make it. Well, yeah, I'd drop everything, and 8 o'clock and, get going down there, but he couldn't make it.
Yeah.
I remember another time, he was combining across the road, nice, beautiful day, and somebody came over to talk to him about the interstate. He got off his combine, let the combine run for 45 minutes talking to this guy, wasting a beautiful afternoon. And, this was endless. He was doing some work in his shop, and he was going to go get ready. He was supposed to meet with a farm management guy, and somebody else stopped in, and he argued with him for an hour. So he was late for his farm management thing. When he took the cows down, I believe he was to Madison in April of '76. I believe he was down there for 3 weeks.
Wow.
He did come home once in between, but he went back down there again, and we were wondering, when is this guy going to get his farm work done? This is spring, April,
Yeah.
early May.
Yeah.
And he was down there, and everybody else was getting their planting oats and whatever done, and
Yeah.
Klesick, has more land than just about anybody else in the area, and he was in Madison. While Eric was running the farm, but I don't know if he was getting much farm work done other than what he had to do. But this was ongoing with Ed, and I know he was at the feed mill in Haven, and he got in a big argument with Archie Bross, and got so heated, Ed went in his truck, you know, and waited till Archie left, and then I guess he went back in again. But that, you know, Ed would come over there once in a while, and he'd be on the phone, you know, half hour, 45 minutes straight. This went on, you know, this was over a 5-year period that he was doing this, and you know, on the one hand, you got to think the guy's a little crazy, but I mean, on the other hand, like Kate said, I mean, he was a fighter and he was committed
Yep.
to the hilt, and
Yeah.
he was losing less land than most of the other guys
Yeah.
were,
Yeah.
and he would not give up. And I also remember Kate mentioned that he went to see some, you know, officials, I believe in the Carter administration. I know earlier in 1975 when Gerald Ford was president, yet I know that Ed went to Washington, D.C. to meet with the Secretary of Transportation, Mr. Coleman, and that didn't do him any good, but he made the trip. And
Yep.
you know, this is all on his own time. He's not getting reimbursed by anybody for this. It
Yeah.
was just total commitment. And,
Commitment.
you know, we agree or we don't agree with what he did, but I mean, the commitment was there, and you know, it's he's going to be remembered as kind of a legendary figure in this community years after we're all gone. So,
Yeah.
thank you.
Well, very good. Thank you for that personal touch on that. Thank you. Okay, we got a hand up here, and the gentleman will identify himself.
Yeah, the meeting with Governor Lucy at Ed Klessig's house, it was, I think, in the early afternoon, and we were in the middle of, there's a sitting room on the southwest corner of the brick house on the Saxon Homestead Farm, and Ed and Margaret, you know, lived in that house at that time. And I was sitting with my back to there's a big picture in the back, a portrait, and I was sitting with Edwin Klessig on my right and Edward Klessig on my left. And Governor Lucy was in front of me, sitting on the south side, looking to me and a couple of his aides. And then there were people around in the room, and I don't remember who they were, but it was an incredible moment. Edwin Klessig brought up the vote that he made in favor of the highway and talked about how he had been deceived, actually, by what was promised and said and what he understood the vote was about. I don't remember the details. Some of it had to do with the route, some of it had to do with the size, everything of the highway. And basically what Edwin Klessig did was chew Governor Lucy's butt. I mean, he just let him have it. And we were sitting there stunned, and Lucy didn't say a thing. Edward didn't say a thing. Edwin just went on for 10, 15 minutes, and he just berated to the governor, and the governor took it all. Lucy just took it all, and, you know, he was polite and all that. It was not exactly a friendly situation for the governor, you know, but I just remember Edwin, you know, he was 80 years old at the time, and, you know, here's the senior guy, the old wise man, you know, and he was just letting him have it. And I just remember that incident, you know, and I wish we would have had a tape of that or, you know, photos or something, but we don't. But I was sitting there in the middle of that, and I was rather, I mean, I just can't forget that. I can just see it. We had, you know, one of the issues that Kate and I and other people who were trying to manage the organization was reining people in, you know, to keep them on one path and everybody, you know, on the same page, so to speak. And of course we have Ed, you know, the personality and the you know, really the force, going out there and just doing his thing. And so, you know, it got a little tense once in a while because we were trying to mount a legal campaign. We were, you know, trying to have the same voice that everybody, and Ed was always 3 steps ahead of us in everything that was going on. But we, you know, Ed was one issue, and we're really happy that we had him because the movement wouldn't have been the same without him. I think what we learned from it, though, when we got again to poor Tom Freist, was we were a lot more organized. We reined ourselves in. We hired good law firms. We raised a lot of money. We did all kinds of things, and we did them, you know, straight, legal, whatever. With the highway fight, it was different. We didn't have a lot of money. I don't know if we raised more than maybe $10,000. Some of the farmers gave money, you know, for our legal costs. I think Fran Buda threw in money, and I don't know who else. But, you know, there were some characters in the movement like Eric Klessig and Andy Orth and some, you know, who, maybe did things or threatened to do things. And I remember Eric made it into the papers, and it's in one of the articles where he said that people are going to get hurt. And this was something that we really feared, you know, because we didn't want this to happen. That would have ruined the whole thing for us.
That's right.
And I remember some of the classics, I think including Eric, came over with a pickup truck one day, and they said they're surveying down, you know, on South Cleveland Road or something like that. And they all had pitchforks. And I refused to get in the truck. I said, I'm not going to go along if you guys have pitchforks, and I wouldn't go. Well, nothing happened, you know, but I didn't want, that was going too far. You know, we were trying to maintain a civil disobedience, a legal, you know, movement, and that went a little too far. And I know that somebody put sand in one of the gas tanks of one of the construction bulldozers or something, and of course the engine was ruined when they started it up. And there was one day, and I don't know where it happened, where the IAA protesters who were there, you know, out on when the bulldozers were in, I wasn't around at that time, but they took all the keys out of the vehicles, out of the bulldozers, and so the construction crew came and they couldn't start anything, and they didn't have any keys. Why they left the keys out there, I don't know, but somebody took them, you know. So that was, you know, that was another thing that happened, and I was talking to Joe Dvorak the other night, and I confirmed this with Ed. Joe Dvorak's wife, Lynn, is from England. And sometime right after this highway fight, they went to England to visit her family. And they were on a ferry between Britain and France, because there wasn't, the channel wasn't constructed at that time yet, so he had to take a ferry or fly. They were on the ferry. They get into a conversation with an American on this ferry, and he turns out to be a highway engineer from Madison. And I don't remember the name. But, and Joe said something about, well, you know, we were fighting this I-43 in eastern Wisconsin. And the guy looked at him and said, are you Klesic? and he said, no, I'm not Klesic, I'm Joe Dvorak. And the guy said, good, because I would have thrown you overboard. So you know, it was just, there was all these things, these stories that come back to you after a while about things that happened on, you know, but for the most part, we had a civil, you know, protest, and that's the way it stayed, you know, with a few little exceptions. Nobody got killed, nobody got hurt. I mean, you know, it was.
You did it in the right way.
And you know, it went as far as it did, and you know, we lost that particular battle, but we all learned a lot of things, and you know, we use the highway and that sort of thing now, but at the time that seemed to be the best thing to do, and so Kate and I, we spent a lot of time talking about how to keep the organization, you know, focused, you know, keep it and have some kind of a plan, you know, and it didn't always work quite the way we would have liked it, but it was a very interesting event.
I got a question.
Yep.
Now, when the highway began to be constructed and the surveyors were out there, at what point did people say, I guess we've lost? Was it a meeting that was held, or was it just a sort of a slow dissipation of the people attending, or was there a formal saying, we tried, but it didn't work?
I don't recall that there was a formal dismissal of the group.
Okay.
We continued to meet socially afterwards with reunions. It went on after the actual cutting of the route in the form of litigation for settling the disbursement of money. And you might be able to answer that one better. Not being a landowner, I wasn't a party to those, but I know a lot of the affected landowners did file petitions or appealed the dollar amount and had hearings, and I think all of those who did got more money than they had originally been awarded, which was the right thing, because the value of the land had escalated over the years, and it had originally been quite low. And at this time, farm prices, the land values were really going up. We were, I think maybe at one point, maybe even talking $1,000 an acre, which now is maybe high. But at that time, right going up to the 80s, farmland was increasing tremendously, almost out of control. And I know that the prices of cattle were high. The whole thing was escalated. So this adjustment of the rates was, in my opinion, justified.
Okay. I'll pan over. Go right ahead, please.
Richard Wiggin. Land values in the 70s went up, and then they crashed in the 80s, and a lot of farmers had borrowed on land values, and then when, some of the banks called in their money, or they were worried about, some farmers went out of business. The 80s were a difficult time for dairy farmers because land values had gone down, and milk prices were also very low. The other thing we were facing in the 70s was the oil embargo by OPEC.
Okay.
After the 73 Israeli war in the Middle East, there was OPEC, cut the supply. And I don't remember how high gas went, but for the latter part of the 70s, prices of gas were high. And we were reading articles that actually traffic would decrease, because we would find alternatives, and there would be commuter trains and all that. People were talking about that in the middle 70s. That was in the middle of some of the discussion, in the middle of, when we were talking about the interstate. Now you look at how much people drive, and how could 141 hold all this traffic? Well, it was obviously, the traffic was getting through yet in the 70s, on what we had. Granted, it wasn't, the best driving. But, we thought that maybe our peak of driving had come, and actually, of course, it didn't. Things turned around in terms of, fuel prices.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have a word called a float happening in time here, and this young lady will identify herself and fill us in.
Kate Judy, and shortly after we were arrested, which I think was June 4th, if memory serves me. Thinking about it now, it was my sister's birthday, and I'm thinking that it was June 4th, 1976. But there was a bicentennial parade on July 4th, 1976.
Okay.
And we had a float, the Interstate Alternative Association, and I have to say that it was quite an embarrassment. It consisted of a hay wagon, and we wanted to have a cow in it, but we didn't think that the cow would behave itself. So we ended up with just this little itty bitty calf in this big, huge, giant hay wagon. And one of the classics said, it was Bucky actually who made the sign for it, and it was bureaucracy versus the people. And Bucky ran into the house, "Mom, how do you spell bureaucracy?" And Margaret Klessig, the grade school teacher in, what township did she teach in? In town of Mosul? Pigeon River?
No, in Sheboygan.
In Sheboygan. Pigeon River. Well, anyway, she misspelled bureaucracy. So through the whole thing, and if you see the picture, you'll see that bureaucracy is misspelled. And we went with it anyway because time was of the essence.
Okay.
But we sang songs that whole time and marched. And there were quite a few of us. I'd say that well, we'll see the picture maybe and be able to count heads.
Very good.
There was a nice showing there.
Good. Thank you very much for supplying that. Okay, go right ahead, please.
John Wiggin. No, I was to answer a previous question. I was not on the county board at that time. Charlie Kramer was at the time when the interstate battle was going on.
All right.
Go back to the couple things mentioned. Yeah, I remember that parade that they ran through in that bicentennial thing. I was on the street, kind of around a corner, watching. No way was I going to get in that thing. I was watching. Edward was pretty much leading the thing, and he was out there with his, his farm overalls on and marching like a king.
Now, before you continue, this was where was the parade taking place?
Well, on one of the streets in Manitowoc, I don't know if it was Washington or whatever, one of the main streets. Ed was, I think, leading the parade, and he was, his usual swagger with, not bashful, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And people were kind of looking at him, and well, they knew who he was by that time. But I was glad I was on the side. I don't want to be out there. The other thing, to go back a minute, you asked the question earlier, when did this thing kind of dissolve? Well,
Yeah.
I was never as intensely involved as the people up front here were, but I was kind of a second, back bench player or something like that. I came in when needed. In fall of '76, I believe it may have been September, some judge in Madison made some ruling against us, and I can't remember the judge's name, but we were kind of scornful of him. And I think that pretty well ended it, at least for me. I thought, it's over with now. I moved on. I had other things to get involved in. And again, I didn't put the time in that classics and my brother and Kate and some of the others did, but I was a, background participant, and when this judge made this ruling, this is it for me. I'm leaving, and
Okay.
I'm moving on, and I did.
Good. Well, thank you for sharing that, John. Appreciate it. Okay, this gentleman tried to provide a slide, but the equipment failed a little bit. But he's got some visual and audible information. Go right ahead, please.
I'm Fred Jacoby. Well, I took the picture because it was part of the parade, and I had two sons marching in the Lincoln Band for the parade, but I took more pictures. And so I knew I had this picture, and I found it without too much trouble with the filing system as I have it. But it's a hay rack pulled by, I think it's Irvin Schmidt's Rumley oil pull tractor, and a bunch of people marching behind the hay rack and some on the hay rack, and a lot of paper around the high rack. And bureaucracy is printed on real big one place, and word by itself, nothing else. But it was part of the big bicentennial parade in '76. And the slide was processed in June '76, so the parade was apparently earlier, a few weeks or a week or so before, early June.
Yeah.
Fits. And so I'll bring my own equipment along the next time, because it's great to see.
Okay. We'll add it on to
It's a very clear slide, but the projector would not.
Projector wouldn't give you what you want. Thank you very much. Right ahead, please.
John Wiggin again. It was intended to be, I believe, a bicentennial parade, but I think it was in early June, and only a few days after they were arrested on the bulldozer thing, when people were really focused on all this, and I think that's why there was kind of a scornful crowd, or at least some people were looking at them a little bit suspiciously. Who are these people? The ones that were in jail a few days before. I believe it was early June, just after the arrests at the bulldozer incident, when this parade took place, and I think that would coincide with what Mr. Jacoby has on his slide. But it was intended to be a bicentennial parade. They did it earlier because people aren't home on the 4th of July.
Yeah, sure.
So,
very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a hand up here, please. Go right ahead.
Kate Judy. I think that John is correct on that it was shortly after the day that we got arrested. And it was an emotional time. We sang, I think, patriotic songs as we marched. And I don't remember being adversely received by the crowd. In fact, I think that we even got some applause from some people. But it was an emotional time. And as John had mentioned before, it was because it was close to the day that we had been arrested. And a lot of the people who were arrested were marching at that time as well.
Okay.
So it was an emotional time.
Very good. Thank you.
We didn't win the prize.
You didn't win the prize, no. Thank you. Okay, we're looking at a picture here, black and white, and there's two gentlemen there, and this other gentleman that's holding it will give us some information. Go right ahead, please.
Richard Wiggin. One of the after effects of the highway fight was that we got into contact with higher officials, and we felt a little more comfortable, and I know Ed got very involved with the Democratic Party at that time, and Ed managed to invite Jerry Brown, the governor of California, when he was here campaigning for president in 1980 for the April primary. And so Jerry Brown came over to Ed's farm for I don't know, it was a little before the primary, but he came over there and we had a meeting in the shed there. And this is not my photo. I took a number of photos at that event that was there. And this is Jerry Brown, the governor of California, running for president of the United States. He didn't do very well in the Wisconsin primary and dropped out of the race, so maybe his meeting with Ed was his kiss of death. I don't know. but anyway, it was these were national figures. Were hanging around in Centerville,
Mm-hmm.
and when I reflect back on this, and we had some more battles after that. Of course, Safe Haven came along, and 3 Mile Island and I don't know what else basically killed the Haven nuclear fight that we were starting to mount, where the Kohler Whistling Straits golf course is now. That was utility property there. They bought it from the Army. They had a base there before, and they were going to put a nuclear plant there. And boy, we didn't like that idea too much. And then, like I said, Tom Friess came along, and we were ready for him, unfortunately for him. But after we had 3 battles in a row, and I was coming and going in all this, I was in the Peace Corps, I was in California, I was doing this, and I'd come back and raise hell when I came back, and people were saying to me, well, you're just a NIMBY, you're just not in my backyard person, don't you represent something, aren't you for something rather than just being against everything,
Mm-hmm.
And we thought about that, and I reflected on that, and so instead of fighting things, we decided to start Centerville Settlement. And Kathy Sixel and Edith Lutze and Dorothy Anderson and Richard Lutze and Sarah Lutze and who else was in? Janet Lutze. And we decided to do something positive and form a historical preservation group. So that was 1982-83 we started Centerville Settlement. And then in the let's see what else happened. In the 1990s, there was the Fisher Creek thing where Fisher Creek was established as a county state park. I was not involved in that because I was away, but my brother John was involved in that. Then there was Point Creek. We have a nature area. We got into preserving pieces of green along the lakeshore. So we were fighting to preserve, we were against development, okay, but we were fighting to preserve parks. We were trying to make parks, nature areas, and that sort of thing. And then Kathy and I, we got together and we said we need an oral history group, so a number of things I think have happened in town Centerville because of the highway fight. We were mobilized, we had been beaten back, but we were mobilized to do things, and so we get an idea, and we had the energy, and we knew how to get things done, so we just went and did them. So I think the highway fight had a rather positive effect in some ways in a lot of things that are going on in Centerville. And Centerville may just seem like any other little township, rural township, 1,200 people or whoever lives out there. Don't mess with Centerville, because we might seem like we're asleep, but all of a sudden something comes along and we get all riled up and we make things happen. All of a sudden these bees are, really active. So I think it's made Centerville in some ways a better place.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got a lot of things that have been done, a lot of things going since that time, and I guess I'm rather proud of that. So I think some good has come out of this. There was one other thing I wanted to mention. I was at a birthday party in Spooner for some little girl that I barely know, but I ended up at this birthday party, and there was a woman there named Dorothy. And I started talking to her, and of course, being a genealogist, I have to interrogate everybody. Where are you from? Where did you go to school? All this. And this woman was a law student in Madison in the 1970s, and she worked as a law student at the Public Intervener's Office. She was working for Tom Dawson and Kathleen Falk. And I didn't know who she was, she didn't know who I was, and I talked about the highway fight, and she said, "Oh, Klessig. I know him." And I said, well, you know, I was important too, you know, I mean, you hear about Klesik so much, you know, well, there were other people that were involved in this, you know, but yeah, you know, what was your opinion? Well, she said, I was doing a lot of the background work for Kathleen Falk, trying to support you guys, you know, in the legislature and all that sort of thing, and she eventually became an instructor at what is it called, Northland College in Ashland. It's environmental college. And she's an instructor, she's a professor. She got a, I don't know if she got a PhD or not, but anyway, she said, I know you guys lost the fight, but you remember the environmental impact statement. That used to be just a rubber stamp for whatever project. That changed. After that, environmental impact statements actually stopped some projects or certainly halted them because, and I remember my impression of the environmental impact statement was that it was a rubber stamp for the highway. I mean, basically it was trying to justify the highway. Well, she said that changed. The law changed on that, and she said a number of other things changed in the law that made it harder for, you know, government to just run through your backyard and do these things. You know, I don't know if that's true or not, but she said a lot of things happened because of the highway fight in eastern Wisconsin, you know, in the background of Madison. So I was, you know, I liked hearing that. That was, it was very nice.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, we got a gentleman here that has his hand up. You ready, please?
John Wiggin. I just was going to mention my brother Richard reeled off all the things Town Centerville did. He forgot one, which Kate and I and Brian Kramer and Elroy and Jerome Yeager were involved in. That was the Farmland Preservation Bill, which Town Centerville pretty much did the lead and the push, and it became a state law. So Town Centerville got in on that one too. I just would like to apologize a little that the Wiggin brothers are dominating this thing. My colleague here on the right would like to say a few words before we close down.
Very good. Thank you very much. Right ahead, sir.
Rick Beyersdorf. Got a couple of comments in regard to my memories, and then to follow up as well on Mr. Wiggin. In the 1970s, when this was happening in I-43, I owned property in Town Mimi, so I wasn't directly confronted with this, but I was aware of what was going on. And in fact, when I was in medical school, we were very aware of the cows down at the Capitol. But shortly after the I-43 project, again, I live on East Spring Valley Road, Town Mimi. The Mimi River abuts East Spring Valley Road. In fact, the road has to curve to go around it. Town Mimi wanted to straighten the road, move the river, environmental impact. My uncle, who lived adjacent to us, who's an avid hunter and fisherman, Rolly Rick, Herb Vanderblumen, who was a great super land game warden and made excellent homemade elderberry wine, supported the project, and they did an analysis and assessment. And in fact, they were not allowed to move the road. I mean, move the riverbed. They had to take the river, leave it as it is, and the roadbed goes around. So East Spring Valley Road is not a straight road because of the efforts of Ed Klesik, who did support it, Herb Vanderbloom, Roland Rick, and they have to go around.
Very
so
good.
The river stays as it is.
Wonderful, wonderful. Good. Thank you very much for sharing that. Right ahead, sir.
Ed Klesik is here, so the Wiggins can dominate this thing. Richard Wiggin, I thank John for bringing up the farmland preservation. What was his name? The fellow from Chicago that was involved.
Bob Levin.
Bob Levin helped us, helped them, us. I was involved in it a little bit too, but what happened after that was Town Centerville adopted farmland preservation. I think we were the first ones in Manitowoc County to do that. And the township I live in Spooner, in Washburn County, does not have any zoning of any kind yet. You know, you can do anything you want in the town of Evergreen, where I live right now, which is a little bit frustrating, but people want it that way. So anyway, the other thing that happened was too, not just farmland preservation, which was hugely important, but I remember we started a recycling program in the town of Centerville, and I was the first recycling chairman, and I did that for a couple of years. We had the first clean sweep program in Manitowoc, and I did that for the first 2 years. I was involved in that committee. There were a number of environmental, good things, protection things that came in as a direct result, again, of the highway fight and, other things. But that came in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s that were implemented. And yeah, I forgot that. I'm sorry, but there were other things out there that happened.
Good. Thank
because
you.
of this.
Thank you. Ed, please.
Kathy Pierce.
Thank you, Kathy. Right ahead, please.
Irene Dine,
Thank you, Irene.
Alice Mathias,
Thank you, Alice.
Willard Matthias.
Thank you, Willard.
Fred Jacoby.
Fred, thank you.
Melvin Yates,
Thank you, Melvin.
John Wiggin.
Thank you, John.
Rick Beiersdorf.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for coming.
Kate Judy.
Kate, thank you so much. You did a fine job tonight. We enjoyed you and good personal touches to your information. Thank you.
Richard.
Thank you, Richard. Good job. Pan through the open area here.
Eugene Moiser.
Thank you, Eugene, for coming.
Walter Caress.
Walter, thank you for coming in this rainy evening.
Marie Pippard.
Thank you for coming, Marie.
Edith Litzy.
Thank you, Edith.
Charlie Bauer.
Thank you, Charlie. And we'll pan over to this lady here, and she'll provide some future information. Right ahead, please.
Kathy Sixel, and I would like to thank Richard and Kate for their fine information. It must have been a great time in your life. Taught you many lessons, huh? For the future. So our next meeting is going to be October 9th, and it'll be here, and I think it's in this room. I'll put it on the card. And it's going to be on cheese factories.
Okay.
And we're going to try and do a new thing. We're going to go like to the little cheese factories that are left, and we want to video them, what is left of them. We did Willard's already, right? We did the Matthias, but then we've got, Audrey's going to be here. We're going to